Managing Databases Part 2 of 3. In this nugget, we're going to move from the create database statement, which we used in the previous nugget, and now turn to altering the properties of existing databases. The centerpiece of what we'll do in this nugget specifically is that I'll show you how to rename a MySQL database. This is a common question among newcomers to MySQL administration. I'll also show you several SQL and MySQL specific database administration statements that we can get to both from within the MySQL terminal monitor as well as the MySQL admin external utility. As usual, let's get to work. Altering databases. To alter structural properties or behavioral properties of a database in MySQL, we use the alter database DDL statement. As a point of review, you'll remember that DDL is the three-letter acronym that's used to describe any SQL command. And when I say SQL, I'm not referring to a particular vendor's implementation. We're talking about ANSI ISO SQL, and that'll be cascading to Oracle or MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server, whatever. But DDL is where we bring new objects into existence, create database, create table, create index. Alter is the second of those DDL statements. Alter means to change. So in this example, we're saying alter database test DB, and then after that, where we've identified the target database, you've got really just a couple options at the database level that we can change. For most other objects in MySQL, an alter statement will provide much more flexibility. But when you think about it, the database itself is simply a container for other objects. So really, the only things we can get to here are the character set and the collation. You'll recall from earlier discussions, and I'm using a formal definition from the MySQL reference manual here. A character set is a set of symbols and encodings. A single character set may have one or more associated collations from which you can choose. A collation is a set of rules for comparing characters in a particular character set. So we can use show character set, for instance, from within the MySQL client to get a run of all of the character sets and collations that are currently installed on an instance of MySQL Server. As a matter of fact, we'll use that very command momentarily when we go into the demo. You'll also remember, as a point of review, that the main time you'll want to change your character set for a database, or for a single column in a table, or in some other programmatic context, is when you have string values that map to languages that may not be covered by the current character set in use. Remember, when we think of character set and collations, everyone, we need to think of localization, regionalization. What language are we dealing with? Is it German, where you have a lot of accent characters, or Spanish, or French? Or are we talking about a language that uses a very unusual character map, like Mandarin? So the character set and the collate statements are used in conjunction with the alter database statement to make these changes. Now, on the issue of renaming a database, let's say we have a database called DB1, and for some business reason, we've been asked by a work group in our organization, could we please rename that database to DB2? First thing you're going to say as a MySQL DBA is, do you business analysts really understand the ramifications of what you're asking? You want to be very careful about this, and I'm just giving you the basic 4 steps that you see in this array. There's actually some stuff beyond this dealing with permissions and privileges, and then even beyond that dealing with connectivity with your line of business applications that's all beyond the scope of this course. But the fundamental principle is, if we've designed our database correctly, we shouldn't need to change its name. But then again, you know as well as I do, in business, stuff happens. So in MySQL, the general principle for changing a database name is, 1, to dump out the database data from the old database. Now, dump is a MySQL term that refers to taking a backup of. So when you see dump, don't think, what does this mean? Delete? No, we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about using, for instance, the MySQL dump external utility to take a backup of all of the rows, all of the objects, all of the schema, the whole deal of the database, in this case DB1. And that'll get output to a .sql script file. All right, so once we've captured the schema and the row information in step 1, we would then create a new database on our MySQL instance and give it the new name. So create database DB2 is what we would use from the MySQL terminal monitor, for instance. In step 3, we would then reload the data into the new database. Easy way to do that is from a shell prompt, MySQL less than symbol, and then the name of the .sql that was output when you did your initial data backup. This is going to bring in the contents of that .sql file and load them into a target database. Fourth and final step, of course, you'll verify to make sure that the databases are identical as far as their contents and structure are concerned. You'll use drop database to drop the old database and then start pointing your applications and users toward the renamed instance. So that's about as elegant as it gets. It's not just a case of rename database. If you go scrounging through the MySQL reference manual, you'll see that MySQL did support a rename database command, but the MySQL team disabled it in MySQL 5.1 because they felt it was a little bit too dangerous, that it would lead DBAs into a false sense of security, thinking that once you simply rename the object, your work is finished. And as I said, your work is far from finished. This operation just simply creates a new database with a new name that has the same data as the old database. You still have to go through with your security hat on and make sure that all privileges are appropriately reestablished. What we see on this whiteboard is a cornucopia, kind of a hodgepodge of different database administration statements. So you're going to see create here, you're going to see show, you're going to see set. These are standard SQL, or in the case of show, non-standard SQL statements that pertain to database-wide scope actions. And a lot of that, as I referred to in the previous whiteboard where I showed you how to rename a MySQL database, deals with security. So account management, create user, alter user, drop user. Once we've created a new MySQL user, just the user itself in the MySQL database is not going to get you anywhere. You've got to grant that user permissions to one or more database objects. You see what I mean? Security is beyond the scope of the CMA objectives. We'll be covering that, and by that I mean MySQL security, in a separate Nugget series. Table maintenance is another category of database administration statements. We're going to be covering this later on in this course. We've got analyze table and optimize table. Set is a really nice way to set variables at runtime. Thus far, we've spent most of our time setting options at the server level by using our my.ini or my.cnf option files. But of course, we can pass set statements to the MySQLD directly from the command line. Set password, set character set, and so on. And then, as we've come to know and love, our MySQL-specific show statement that will, in a very nice, tidy way, very terse syntactical way, allow us to look at metadata regarding that database. Show me all of the grants, all of the permissions that were explicitly granted on this database. Show engine. Show the storage engine that's being used by default for any tables or indexes that are created on this particular database. In this demo, we're going to do quite a few things, the main things being altering database properties. In so doing, we're going to wind up touring part of the reference manual when we want to look up help, and we'll be issuing some database administration commands. In this demo, we're going to work with the alter database command. And you'll notice that we're no longer in Windows. Kind of reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. And what we're going to do is, from now on, for the rest of this Nugget series, I'll kind of be ping-ponging between Windows and Linux environments. The reason I'm doing this, friends, is twofold. One reason is that I want to prove to you, if you've had any doubt, that MySQL behaves fundamentally the same regardless of the operating system on which the product's installed. And number two, for those cases where there are slight configuration differences, primarily differences in the file system and folder locations between Windows and Linux, I want to be able to physically show you those differences instead of just talking about them. So we are on a Linux system, obviously. Specifically, we're using an instance or an installed version of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a really popular distribution of Linux. I'm using the recently released, as of this recording, 9.04 Jaunty Jackalope version. And especially for those who are newer to Linux, you might want to look at Ubuntu as a great place to get your feet wet with the Linux OS. All right, why don't we open up a terminal shell? I'll use Applications, Accessories, come on over to Terminal for this. I'm going to use the View menu to zoom in to make sure you can see my text a little bit easier. And what we'll do is just log in. I have MySQL 5.1 installed just like I do on the Windows box. And you notice that MySQL took me in without any hesitation. Now you might think to yourself, well, did you make a change in your option file? And if you thought that, congratulations, because that means you're starting to put things together and starting to make important connections here. If we run a select user, which just simply runs the built-in user function and returns the currently logged on MySQL user, we see that sure enough, I'm logged on not as an anonymous user. Ordinarily, if I were to just try to log into the MySQL client with no username, no password, you would only be allowed in if anonymous connections were allowed on the server. But no, you see I'm logged in as root. And by the way, root at localhost refers to a MySQL superuser named root. The root in MySQL has nothing at all to do with the root user in the Linux operating system. Please keep that in mind. MySQL always maintains its own separate list of users. I'm going to do a cd forward, here I am putting in shell commands while I'm in MySQL. Why don't I do a \q to come out of MySQL and to my prompt, and we'll do a cd / to come to the root directory of the file system, and why don't we mosey on over to where our option file is located. Now in Unix Linux, it's located in a folder called etc MySQL. So right off the root, you've got the etc built-in folder, and then when MySQL is installed, there's a subfolder in there. And if we do a directory listing, you'll see there what's our my.cnf. This is the global options file that's read by the MySQL daemon upon startup. You'll remember that in Windows, the option file is my.ini, and it's stored in the MySQL installation directory by default. Another neat thing that Linux offers in MySQL is that you can provide user-specific settings or user-specific default directives in the option file if you create a my.cnf and store it in your home folder. So why don't I open up my.cnf in the gedit utility. Notice I'm using sudo here because we need to make sure we're opening the file with elevated privileges. So I'm prompted for the root password here for the operating system, not for MySQL. Put that in. And if all goes according to Hoyle, the gedit text editor opens and we've got etc MySQL my.cnf open. Good. Now, if we come down a little bit, this should look very familiar to you, friends, because it's the exact same file that we have in Windows. The only difference, of course, is the host operating system. We have our client section where we can pre-populate default directives on the client side when we fire up the MySQL terminal monitor. And I've already added these three behind the scenes. A naked file or a default file only has port and socket on Linux. I added host, user, and password, and you'll see that every time I fire up MySQL client and don't provide a username and password combination, I'll be coming in localhost root with a password of password. Now, what if we wanted to change our password from that really weak password to something a little bit more robust, like that even? Save our changes. Well, of course, that's not going to work very well back in the terminal window. Clear the screen and type MySQL again. Access denied. Well, you know the reason why, right? Well, because the root user in MySQL, which has nothing to do with the root user in Linux, has a different password. So therefore the question comes up, how do we change the password in MySQL? In particular, how are we going to change the root or superuser password? Now we can do that from within the MySQL client, or as what I'm going to do right now is just call MySQL admin, our good old friend MySQL admin. Now if we use the Linux Unix command which, we can tell the operating system where is this executable program file located, and we see that MySQL admin, and also I'm here to tell you all your other binaries, your MySQL client, MySQL dump, and so on, are located by default in user bin. So what we can do to run the command is say MySQL admin. We are going to provide authentication. User is root. And with the password, it can get really sticky if you choose not to put your password directly in. I'm going to put the old password here, right after the P. So -P, and then in single ticks to denote the string, I'll put the old password, space, password, that's the actual command, remember, and then the new passwords. Because since we're working in plain text, we might as well just lay it all on the table here. So we're firing off MySQL admin, we're coming in as root, -P, there's our existing password, the command we're executing now is password, and then there's our new plain text password. You'll note that we didn't get any kind of a confirmation from MySQL admin. It's a little disconcerting at first. The best way to test whether our password has taken or not is simply to fire up the MySQL client and see if it works. It sure did. Let's verify who we are. We are root, so there you go. Now then, let's turn to the meat and potatoes of our training in this nugget, altering database properties. Now, in this example, what we're going to do, first let me do a show databases. Let's see what we have there. Notice that we've got the world database already loaded. I've done this myself. If you've been following these nuggets along, you'll remember that of this list of databases, information schema and MySQL are the only ones that are shipped by default in the product. MySQL is our system database, and actually information schema is as well. I've loaded Sequila and World myself offline. Anyway, let's imagine we had a business need to change the character set and collation being used by the World database. Well, actually, that's a good question, isn't it? How do we find out what the current character set and collation is for the World database? How do we know which character sets and collations are enabled on this server? Well, let's start to use some new commands and see what happens, right? We can use the show character set command to come back with a really tidy table, let me scroll up a bit, of all of the character sets and collations supported by this instance of MySQL server. And what's cool here is that you can see in the second column in the description field, you can get a handle on what language or language families are involved with each character set. So you've got Latin, we've got Unicode, UTF-8, Central European, different Latin-based ones, and so on. Okay, that's great. Now, how about the database in particular? The World database in particular. How can we figure out its character sets that it's set to? First thing we're going to want to do is use the World database, make sure that we're connected to the database and working within its context. Then we can run show variables. What this gives us is a really tidy table of all of the property settings, the configuration variables pertinent to that database. Okay, and it's an alphabetized list, and yes, there's certainly lots of them. We can cut down on what we're seeing instead of seeing all of this data, which is kind of like information overload. We can use the like operator and say, let's just, for instance, show me all the variables that start with C. Don't worry about specifically what I'm doing here, friends, with the like statement and using the percentage sign. We're going to be spending a lot of time in future nuggets when I show you the select statement on using some of these keywords. But by issuing this statement, we're now looking at just a subset of those variables for the database world. And the ones that I want to show you in particular are this one right here, character set database. That tells us that world is currently using the Latin 1 character set. And the other property here is collation database, Latin 1 Swedish. Now let's say we want to change the character set and collation from Latin 1 Swedish to UTF-8 general. So we had some business reason to do so. How do we get that done? Well, I think you know, don't you? We would simply use the alter database statement, pass in the name of the database, and if we want to change the default character set, we can just use that command, default character set, and then we have to be specific, UTF-8. We have to use a character set name that was exactly given by the server. In other words, when you change your character set or collation, you have to look up the appropriate character set and make sure you don't mistype it. That's a good reason for using the show character set command for sure. I could, if I want to, also throw in default collate and then specify a collation. But in this case, I happen to know that if I change the character set to UTF-8 Unicode, it's going to default to giving me the UTF-8 General CI collation. And that's what we need here. Therefore, I can just throw in a semicolon, enter, and that's all she wrote. Now, how can we prove it? We can prove that the changes come into effect by running show variables again. And let's look at character set database. Sure enough, it's now running or set to UTF-8. And collation database is showing UTF-8 General CI. In the next exercise, actually the last exercise of this demo, I'm going to show you how to rename a MySQL database. And what we'll do in this case is we're going to rename the world database to New World. Now you know we can't just go in here and rename the existing object. If you've been following this nugget through the whiteboard section into this demo, you know it's a 4-step process. The first thing we need to do is create an empty shell database with the new name. I'm going to call it New World. There it is. Next thing we're going to do is actually come out of MySQL client back to a shell prompt. And I'm going to elevate to root. I'm just going to use su, provide the Linux root password. All right, you can see we've changed from our $, our unprivileged user prompt, to the octothorpe or hash sign. That's the privileged root account. And now we're root. Let's use the MySQL dump command and the MySQL command to do a data export and a quick data import. So MySQL dump, just like MySQL admin, is an external program that's run from a shell prompt. And in this case, MySQL dump world -p. So we're going to dump or take a backup of all of the rows and schema of the world database and throw that to what's called standard out. Now if I just press enter, after I authenticate of course, I get a whole screen filled with data. It's ugly. And by the way, that authentication I did, I went kind of fast there, is that I was putting in the MySQL root password, not the Linux root password. Yes, this can get kind of confusing at times. You have to watch your prompts. Let me bring back my command. MySQL dump -p takes the whole database and is prepared to give it to the standard out, which is really just memory. And one neat thing you can do in Linux that you have some ability to do in Windows, but I don't think as elegantly, is that you can pipe the output of one command and feed that as an input to a second command. So what we're going to do is use MySQL with the uppercase D parameter, New World, and what this will do is take that backup of world and automatically dump it back into the MySQL instance. Put in my MySQL password, and there you go. Now, there's other ways to go. We could have just run MySQL dump with a slightly different syntax. the greater than symbol basically, and dump the contents of world into a .sql file. And then from a shell prompt like this, we could have said mysql less than, and then the name of our backup file. Now our backup file would have to have the name new world so that MySQL engine knew where to put that file. But that's just another way to do the syntax. Kind of do it in two steps. The backup and the restore in 2 steps. This is a little bit of fancy footwork that does the backup and the restore in 1 step. Let's log into MySQL, show our databases. We've got world and new world. Why don't we show tables from world, city, country, country language, and then we'll do the same thing, show tables from new world, city, country language. Good deal. So at least we're fairly confident that we've copied over the structure. Just for grins, let's do a select star from, well, first let's use the database new world, and then we'll just run a select star from country. Verify that there's rows in there, which there are. Final step would be, after you take care of all of your security permissions and you're convinced that the old database can be decommissioned, you would simply say drop database world and submit that, and then start pointing your users toward the renamed database, in this case, new world. Managing Databases Part 2 of 3 Review. In this insightful nugget, at least I hope it was insightful for you, we looked at altering databases. In other words, once we have a MySQL database up and running on our instance, what are some of the interesting things that we can do to its properties? By way of review, you'll remember that really it's just character set and collation that we can do by using the alter database DDL command. Also gave you a really nice 4-step recipe on renaming databases. And then we spent some time looking at various and sundry database administration statements, accessible both within the MySQL client and from without. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.